What if adding more salt, not less, could actually improve your energy, improve your sleep, and improve your health overall? That might actually just be the case. I'm Mandy, I am the clinical nutritionist with Body Reset, and today I want to talk about salt. I'm talking about this because I see this come up a whole lot with clients that we work with and people that we talk with. There is this fear out there about salt, and I want to dive into a little bit of where that stems from today, but also how we can navigate this if you are health conscious, if you are interested in looking after your health, if you are eating well, moving well, exercising well, drinking enough water, and doing all of the things, you might actually have a need for more salt, not less. So the concern with salt really stems from the fact that salt in the research raises blood pressure. Elevated blood pressure is associated with cardiovascular disease risk, and that's obviously something we want to mitigate because it's a climbing trend in the world today. Now, there is this association, but if you dig deeper into the research, like with all things in the nutrition space, there's really two sides of the story. And actually, when it comes to salt, it's a little bit less cut and dried than we once thought. So while too high salt actually is a problem, it's possible that too low is also a problem. And there was a pretty good review that was published, I think in 2021, that talked about the sweet spot for sodium intake. And actually, the level falls around about 3,000 milligrams to 5,000 milligrams per day. But a lot of the recommendations for what we should drop our sodium intake down to is around about that 1,200 or 600 milligrams per day. So really quite low. And this review actually talks about the fact that even though when that is done initially, we might see a drop in blood pressure, which seems to be a positive outcome, it's very hard to stick to that low level of salt intake. And maybe some of what we're going to talk about today will explain why that is. The other issue with the salt is that a lot of this data is based on population studies, and it's looking at people that are eating a typical westernized diet, which is very highly processed, very low in fruits and vegetables, which are high in potassium. And so there's this really kind of exaggerated salt intake alongside a high carbohydrate intake, alongside a high sugar intake. And so it may not be the salt at all that's really causing the issues, it might be all of the other factors that it's going along with. So if we just flip the coin up the other way for a minute and look at what are the benefits of salt. See, I think when you actually think about it and you look at it in the context of human behavior, even animal behavior, animals in the wild will go to great extents, great extremes in order to get enough salt. Salt has been a prized commodity amongst humans and amongst civilization for a very, very long time, and that suggests that it plays an important role in our health. And if you look deeper, if you actually go into the body and you look at what does salt do in our body, it's one of the most tightly regulated components in our interstitial and cellular fluids, and that is because it's incredibly important. So at a cellular level, sodium is required alongside potassium to build up an electrical current that allows nerve impulses to happen. It allows nutrients to pass into and out of cell membranes. And so when you take that out from the cell level to the tissue level, so cells are the tiny little components that make up our tissues, and our tissues are, our muscles, our organs, our blood, our lymph nodes, and our endocrine glands, all of that. At a cellular level, we need sodium to be able to maintain that electrical current so that we can have nerve impulses that allow things to happen in the body and allow the cells to function. And at a tissue level, that process allows us to be able to contract muscle tissue and to be able to move our body around and for our body to be able to function. Our heart is a muscle, it requires the ability to contract, and that ability to contract comes from having enough sodium and potassium to be able to generate that action potential. And this can impact so many different layers of our health when we think about it, because our whole body is essentially a movement of different coordinated muscle movements. So think about your digestive system. Food does not move through your digestive system if you do not have strong and consistent muscle contraction. And that means you need salt to be able to do that. All of the sphincters that move food down, so from your esophagus to your stomach, that's the area that a lot of people who have acid reflux or GERD struggle with contraction of that sphincter. You require a certain amount of sodium and whatnot to develop the action potential to allow those muscles to contract. It could be on any other level as well, movement or exercise, etc. Feelings of fatigue and weakness can often be that lack of ability to contract muscles, which could be due to an imbalance of those electrolytes. So sodium's really, really important. And I think where this comes into play is that you're probably not watching this video if you're out binging on junk food and drinking alcohol and doing all the things that really do create an issue for high sodium intake, you're probably watching this video if you are someone who's interested in health, if you are doing some health promoting behaviors such as eating good food, eating homemade meals, eating a lot of vegetables, drinking enough water, exercising, and all of those sorts of things. And if you're doing that, the risk of having too much salt is actually very low. The risk of having not enough salt is more likely to be the problem. And this is what I see with the people that I work with and why I talk about salt quite a lot. Because what I often see is people have this fear of salt, but the fear of salt is not really an issue if you are not necessarily eating the foods that are going to push your salt too high in the first place. And in fact, there may be things that are contributing to loss of salt. So there are a few different things that contribute to sodium loss. So things like stresses. Stress has a big impact on our body's ability to regulate sodium reabsorption, keeping it in our body. And so we can tend to lose more salt through chronic stresses or acute stresses or just adrenal response in general. So this can lead to an inability to regulate sodium levels. And that stress might not be an external stressor, it might be an internal stressor. Perhaps there is some ongoing digestive upset or some digestive issues which are causing a systemic inflammatory stress response in the body, and your body is dropping sodium as a result of that. This could be a really real issue for a lot of people. Another one is some medications. So blood pressure medications can have a diuretic effect, which means you can lose sodium for one, and that's their role. But there's other medications which their role is not necessarily around sodium, but they have an impact on sodium. And a really common example of this is the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They are the medications that are used for depression and anxiety. These have a sodium depleting action. And I've seen this actually with several clients that I've worked with where they've been on an SSRI because they've needed it. They've worked in an office environment where there's been a lot of air conditioning, so quite drying. So they're dropping salt, getting a bit dehydrated and feeling really, really foggy and headachy every single afternoon and not sure why, nothing really had changed. And when we put an electrolyte supplement in there for them in the afternoon, some water and some sodium, the headaches and the fogginess just really disappeared. And just kind of shows the importance of sodium in order for us to have good energy levels, good mental clarity, all of those sorts of things. Another big one is actually reducing carbohydrate intake. And I think this is really relevant to the people that I talk to because, again, health conscious individuals, we kind of are starting to understand this interplay between carbs, sugar, and all of that sort of stuff and health impacts now. And if you go from eating a high carb diet to suddenly reducing your carbs, because carbs elevate blood sugar and elevated blood sugar elevates insulin, and insulin causes the body to hold on to more sodium. When you drop your carbs and your blood sugar comes down and your insulin comes down, you tend to lose a lot of sodium in that process. And that's actually partly why people get that keto flu, which they talk about when you go onto keto. It's actually to do with that sodium loss and that change in hydration status. So if you're eating lower carbs, you actually need to be intentionally adding more sodium into your diet in order to maintain your levels. And another one is things like exercise, especially if you're a heavy sweater or you live in a hot environment, or if you are someone who drinks a lot of water while you exercise and you're actually just flushing a lot of electrolytes out of your body, or if you're someone who's into saunaing and you sweat a lot, it's possible to do too much of a good thing and actually end up in a worse situation all along. And you're like, well, why am I feeling so tired and weak and headachy and brain foggy? And I'm doing all of these good things, and it actually might come back to salt. And I see this play out a lot because very often I'm talking to people, we're looking at what they're eating, we're looking at what they're doing, and I'm like, let's just put in a little bit of salt into your afternoon, and I'll talk about how we do that. And very quickly they feel a whole lot better. And a whole lot of things like sugar cravings or needing to get up in the night to pee or feeling like they just can't focus in the afternoon just disappears when we sort the salt issue out. So it really can show up as those kind of more energy fatigue type symptoms. So what I did when it came to the sodium, because I wanted to test the theory here a little bit myself, I measured all of my sodium across a day, a few days in a row, with a food tracking app. So there's a certain amount of sodium in kind of all of the vegetables that you're eating and whatnot, but then I also measured all the salt that I was adding to my food to test where it fell within that, I talked about at the start, that 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams sort of sweet spot of ideal sodium intake. And it was really quite surprising, but I only got to about 1,500 milligrams of sodium in a day. And that was with me, I like salt, salting my food to taste, basically. So I salted as much as I wanted to salt it. and I didn't add any electrolytes that day, so it was just based on my intake. And I was surprised at how low my intake really was, and that was also taken into account the sodium that's just naturally occurring in food as well. And so this is where I think the issue lies, is if you are eating a lot of junk, eating a lot of processed foods, drinking a lot of alcohol, have very high blood sugars, have very high insulin, have high blood pressure, then adding more salt to your day is probably not the first thing that I would recommend for you. However, if you aren't doing those things, if you are eating really well, especially if you're exercising or saunaing, if you're drinking a lot of water, if you're just eating homemade foods, then you possibly need more salt than what you really think. So I have a little bit of a plan here. We'll call this my salt fix. So the first step is salt your food to taste. If you're making your food at home, you will not add anywhere near as much salt to your food, even if you salt it quite heavily, as what would be added into a processed food. Because when you combine salt and sugar alongside some fat, you can kind of bypass the salt. In a way, our body will stop at a certain point when it comes to salt intake, because we know when we've had enough, but you can override that mechanism by adding a whole lot of fat and a whole lot of sugar to it. So that's where the processed food's a real problem, because it can kind of take us past the point of where we might naturally have stopped when it comes to the saltiness. But if you are salting your food at home, even if you're salting it quite well, you're not going to be over adding salt. So first part of the salt fix is salt your food to taste. This is the first start. If you go beyond that, we would need to talk about water when it comes to sodium. So if you're very dehydrated and not drinking enough water, I don't want you to be going and adding a whole lot of salt. If you're feeling foggy and tired and weak or craving sugar and stuff in the afternoon, the first point to call is drink enough water, because it might just be dehydration. That's the problem. But if you are drinking enough water, and by enough water I would say 30 mils per kilo of body weight per day. So some people say 2 liters, some people say 8 glasses. To make it more specific to the individual, because we're all a different size, 30 mil per kilo of body weight per day as a basic baseline. If you sauna, if you exercise a lot, if you live in a hot environment, you possibly need a little bit more than that, but that's a good guide to start with. And then, are you eating plenty of potassium-rich foods? Potassium and sodium work together to create that action potential at the cellular level. So it's the movement of potassium out of cells and sodium into cells that creates that electro kind of current that allows our cells to function and nerve impulses to happen. So potassium's really, really important as well. And I think that this is also an area that highlights a lot of the issues when it comes to the research around salt being bad, is that it's looking at populations that are eating a very westernized diet, which is heavily processed, high in sodium and very, very low in potassium. So it might not be that the salt's the real issue, it might be the lack of potassium that's the real issue. So before we go willy-nilly adding a whole lot of salt to our diet, we want to make sure we are getting hydrated enough and getting enough potassium. And potassium primarily comes from your fruits and vegetables. So it's a really good reminder just to get your fruits and vegetables into your day and eat enough of those to make sure you've got that potassium there. The next part is, assuming you are not on any medications for blood pressure or have high blood pressure, we can actually look at bringing some salt into your day. And how I do this first is, you could use an electrolyte supplement, but to test the theory, I have a little salt drink that I recommend to people, and it is the juice of half a lemon. So you get a little bit of potassium from that, you get some citric acid and some flavor. 1/4 to half a teaspoon of Himalayan salt. You could use a really good Celtic sea salt or some other salt if you like it. I like Himalayan salt for a couple of reasons. One, it has a higher mineral level that's not just sodium. So it has around about 85% sodium, and then about 15% is other minerals, where standardized table salt has about 97% sodium and then just about 3% other minerals. So you're getting a little bit of a microdose of other minerals as well. It's very minimal, but all things add up, right? So 1/4 to half a teaspoon of salt. Now, 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt has around about 500 milligrams of sodium. So this gives you some context here. Remember I said the sweet spot is about 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams a day. When I tracked my sodium, I was getting about 1,500 milligrams a day. So you've got quite a bit of buffer room there to add some sodium and not be overshooting the mark. So 1/4 of a teaspoon to half a teaspoon would give you 500 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium. In with your juice of half a lemon, and then about 200 mils of water. Now, I use about 200 mils of water because if you water it down too much, it tastes a bit like tears, and that is not a good thing to be drinking in the afternoon. So keep it a little bit shorter, a little bit sharper, sourer, saltier, etc. And I recommend putting that in your afternoon. That point in time where you get that energy dip, or you get a bit foggy, you lose focus on what you're doing at work, you feel a little bit fatigued or whatever. Maybe it's where you get a sweet craving or you go looking for something to snack on. Put it in there and then just pay attention to what happens. There's so many people now I've done this for. They're like, it's bizarre, but I instantly feel clearer. I get focused again. I don't have the sugar cravings anymore. I don't have the need to snack. I can just carry on with my day. And it was just having a little bit of extra sodium in there. If you really like that, you could try a good electrolyte supplement. And my caution there is just have a look at the label. You don't want a glucose supplement at this point in time. You want electrolytes, which is sodium, potassium, magnesium, and chloride. So there's a few good ones on the market now that are a decent dose of those, sort of around 500 to 1,000 or slightly over milligrams of sodium, and no glucose added. So you could use those. They're quite convenient to take places if you can get them in a little sachet, and just using that once a day. Now, you can put it any time in your day. I typically recommend starting by putting it in your afternoon, but you could put it in the morning. If you train fasted in the morning, you might put it before your fasted training to help rehydrate yourself first thing in the morning, or you might put it just before bed as well. A little bit of sodium just before bed can sometimes, and I've seen this happen a number of times with clients as well, reduce that need to get up and pee at night. So that's kind of my work through of steps. Is first, just salt your food well. Let's just start to make sure that's happening well, and know that if you salt your food to taste, you will not be going over what you should be intaking of sodium anyway. Make sure you're drinking enough water, eating enough vegetables to get your potassium levels up, and then bring in some intentional added sodium if you need to on top of that, and just see how it feels. If you're listening to this and you are in that situation where you maybe do have high blood pressure, or you are on a blood pressure medication and you can't necessarily apply this, I'm going to link below our blood pressure guide, because obviously if you've clicked into a video about salt, you're probably interested in this space as well, because there's a lot of link between blood pressure and sodium. But that's not the same as what you might think. There's a lot of other things there, and that's what we go into in that training, is just looking at how you can apply some of this. Make sure you're getting enough salt as well, but not have a negative impact on your blood pressure. So I'll link that guide below this one, and you can dive into it if that one's for you, because I don't want you to feel left out of this. But if low energy, brain fog, those sorts of things are your struggle at the moment, and you are really health conscious and you are doing all of the things, play around with your salt intake, because you might be surprised at just how much of a difference it can make. Hopefully that was useful and you got something to take away from that to try, and let me know in the comments if you like my little sour salt drink. I will see you next time. Bye.